Britain in the 1920s and 30s was facing a cultural invasion. America was the new world power, and its wild and wanton ways were threatening our shores. British restraint was under siege and fading fast.
It was a tremendously energised period. You know, the thing about the 20s, whenever you look at the music, the dancing, there's this tremendous pumping of energy going on all the time.
On high streets throughout the country, Hollywood movies were showing ordinary people that life didn't have to be so British.
Just think, Joe, what fun it is to be a newspaper woman like the ones in the American movies.
America's screen gods and goddesses were becoming British national heroes.
All of a sudden, perhaps you don't want to be a princess. Perhaps actually what you want to be is a film star in a lovely, slinky satin dress.
The young were falling for the American dream, but for the old, it was becoming a nightmare.
I don't know what this generation's coming to.
Over the top and over here, this is the story of how American glamour changed Britain forever. Our 21st century fascination with American culture is nothing new. Since the early days of cinema, the British have been seduced by the allure of Hollywood.
There is no other glamour like the glamour of the 20s and 30s, is there? If you think of Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich, they are the most glamorous women that have ever lived.
Glamour isn't beauty. It's something which is surrounded a little bit with magic. It's sort of powdered with a little bit of stardust. And that, in a sense, fits in so obviously to the silver screen, to films.
Going to the pictures was more than a night out in the interwar years. It was a new, exciting mass entertainment that had a profound impact on the lives of ordinary Brits.
It provided a window on the world, which wasn't an accurate window. It wasn't a mirror, of course, but it was a fabulous, distorting, enchanting mirror that people loved and accepted.
When people came out of the First World War, the playing with drugs, the exotic dances, the tango, cocaine, sky's the limit. Silent movies was the right medium for that.
The movie stars of the 1920s were larger-than-life characters. British exiles like Charlie Chaplin would become household names. Today, the plots seem implausible and the acting forced. But in the silent era, British audiences had never seen anything like it. 12-foot images of the mad, the bad, and the scandalous transported them to another world, especially if they were on a horse and called Rudolph Valentino.
Women swooned when they saw him in the shake, but, we really only ever saw him dressed in his full kit and more makeup mainly than women were wearing.
Overpowdered and overdressed, Valentino hinted at sex and sensation. The silent era sirens like Theda Bara were a bit more obvious.
The Vamps were a male projection. Theda Bara was a male attraction, film star geared to a male audience. I'm not saying she had no female fans, but that wasn't what she was about. She was an expression of a kind of sexual creature who, in the recesses behind that curtain was getting up to all sorts. And that was essentially a male fantasy.
The early silent sex bombs had little in common with good British girls who were expected to stay at home until they married. But in the 1920s, potential husbands were in short supply.
I think it's quite important to remember that in 1919, 1920, Britain and the world really were emerging from an absolutely catastrophic, cataclysmic war. Britain had, in a way, become a sort of mutilated society. There was a pall of loss, a pall of grief hanging over the country.
The Great War claimed the lives of 10,000 men a day in the trenches. For the women left behind, it would be a time of immense change. Many had stepped into men's jobs while they were away, others had worked as nurses at the front. For the first time, young women were empowered. There would be no going back.
Throughout the country, women took on all kinds of jobs. This film shows gas masks being made for the men in the trenches, and here, fighter pilots have their planes tended to by women. Some of these jobs would have been inconceivable for any respectable pre-war girl. But attitudes were changing, and new jobs meant more money, new freedoms, greater self-confidence. In short, a new emancipation.
One of the byproducts of the war was these women had been left on their Todd, and their husbands and brothers and things had gone away. And so they were making the decisions, they were running the households. And I think it was very difficult for women, actually, after both wars, when the men came back, to suddenly find that in many cases they were expected to suddenly, get back in the kitchen, all the rest of it. And to a certain extent with the young, that didn't happen. Their confidence stayed.
British life was changing, and it wasn't the men leading the way. The weaker sex was getting stronger. The women's suffragette movement had won the right to vote, but only for wealthier women. In the 1920s, their campaign was spreading to young working-class women who also wanted a voice.
The women at that time knew they were riding on the backs of giants. They weren't the originators. The giants were the new women of the 1890s. They were the suffragettes, for goodness sake, who were the heroines of the cause. But 1920s young women came along and they rode along on it. They said, OK, let's ride the crest of this wave. The suffragettes, the new women, have done the hard work. They have broken down the barricades. Now let's get out there and rejoice. Let's lift our skirts. Let's have a ball. Let's have a party.
This was a generation with little interest in the past. Women wanted their futures to be modern, and it was in their local picture houses that they first saw glimpses of the lifestyles they would come to crave.
Everybody started going to the movies, and the movies that they saw were Hollywood movies, and they were promoting some actresses who lived in ways that, a normal woman from, the Midlands in England would never have dreamed possible. The female role models that women would have started to see from Hollywood movies were utterly unlike any kind of role model that they would have seen before.
They're absolutely exceptional individuals who were unusual, odd, and tantalising for that reason.
One American actress would show British women what they might be capable of.
Clara Bow is the kind of archetypal X-Factor girl of the 1920s. She enters a talent competition, and that's how she becomes a movie star. And the reason that we remember her today especially is that she starred in a film called It.
The 1927 film It turned its leading lady into a star, and its title became synonymous with sex appeal. On screen and off, Clara Bow was the original It girl, more interested in having a good time than behaving properly. The Cinderella story of transformation was exactly what young British women were dreaming of.
It's a really great movie, actually, because it completely focuses on her and her desire. She's a shop girl, and she looks across at the owner of the department store who's kind of come down to inspect, and she just looks at him, and suddenly you know that she's going to have him. And there's this great intertitle which says, "Sweet Santa Claus, give me him." She goes out to get him, and she totally gets him. And actually, one of the ways in which she does that, thinking about this kind of concept of glamour, is by making herself glamorous.
The film was silent, but its message was loud and clear. Girls, you can make it too. You just need glamour, sex appeal, and a big pair of scissors.
There's this great sequence where she, it gets him to invite her to the Ritz, and she realises she's got nothing to wear. So she cuts up her store uniform and makes it into this great ball gown.
Clara Bow was one of the first shopgirl movie stars. She was in one way an ordinary little girl just like you and me, and in another way ravishingly pretty, in exactly the right way for the 20s. Clara Bow, I think, was a very American star. She was very much an expression of Americana.
She absolutely represents this concept of the young woman who is throwing convention out of the window, is out for a good time, is not afraid to express desire, who is modern.
Young women could afford to go to the cinema 2 or 3 times a week. And American movies were showing these girls that wherever they came from, they too could transform their lives into something special.
Obviously, if you were young and you looked at your mother and you looked at the life she had had, you thought, well, maybe actually there's something to be said for sex appeal, for being an it girl. So I think in a way that we now think of Hollywood as being sort of sheer consumption, but I think in many ways it was peddling a different message. It was saying, there's another way and there's a world out there to go and grab.
As Hollywood grew more sophisticated, so too did its stars. By the 30s, the British working classes could spend an evening with some of the most glamorous people in the world.
The word glamour first became very popular in the 1930s. Its history is actually quite complicated. The word derives from Scottish. It was first used by Walter Scott in 1805 to mean a magical power that could make something or someone look much better than they really were. The reason for the term becoming so popular in the 1930s is precisely because film, more than any other medium, achieved this ability to make things seem better than they were.
Cute. I'd like to kiss you, but I just washed my hair. Bye.
In many ways, glamour is different from beauty. Glamour is something that can be acquired, it can be something that can be bought. So in a sense, it's democratic. That was the idea, I think, of glamour, that it was democratizing. It did give the shop girl, the mill girl, the opportunity that, she too could be she could be glamorous. She might never be beautiful, she might never be rich, but she could be glamorous.
A shop girl in Newcastle who goes to the movies and sees Gloria Swanson is going to be swept away by the glamour of it. She's not going to be able to wear a dress like that, but she is going to be able to paint her nails or have her hair waved in that way. And that's where this incredible power of the industry to create trends and create money for the people behind it is really starting.
America's cultural and commercial assault started after the First World War, when Britain was £1,100 million in its debt. Mass production and consumerism had made the USA rich. Their standard of living was 5 times higher than the UK's. By the 30s, most Americans had 4 wheels, when many Brits still had 2. The United States was the envy of the world.
America holds the strings to the consumer purse, and that everything everybody wants, like Coca-Cola or the latest jazz records, comes from America.
America had industrialized later than Britain, and so it had all sorts of all its new technologies, much more up-to-date methods, and of course a huge country, a vast labour force, and of course a vast purchasing population. So mass production took off in America in a way that it never could and it never would in Britain.
Technological developments like washing machines, hoovers, fridges, electric cookers meant that household life was freed up. You didn't have to spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week doing the laundry and just making sure your family had enough to eat. Those things really liberated women. And so their expectations of life grew greater.
Young women started to lavish their spare time on themselves. Using makeup became widespread when American mass production found its feminine side.
They made lipstick cases, twist-up lipstick cases, which were developed from a cartridge shell in the First World War. Hinged powder compacts for the beauty business, and they had labelling and bottling plants, and the cosmetics companies were churning it out.
Seduced by the promise of beauty, makeup became irresistible to women, regardless of their class.
I mean, coloured cosmetics up until roughly the beginning of the First World War were used by actresses, which was absolutely fine, or whores, which was not. So ladies who used makeup, because Queen Victoria hated makeup, and so the whole ritual of wearing coloured cosmetics was absolute no-no. So if you wanted to buy a lipstick, you had to sort of, go behind your hand to hide the conversation with the shop girl, and then she would find you the lipstick.
The plain girl needn't be plain, says this popular artist and physical culturist. Take this girl, for instance. Let's try the face. That's the little pale oval under the hair. It's one thing to draw the line and another to know where to draw it.
The girls were flaunting tradition. They loved it. They would take out their powder compact and strike a pose with it. And this was something which they knew that their mothers and their grandmothers would hate and tick them off for, so they were instinctively loving it.
An ever so discreet touching up and glamour's just around the corner. In fact, it's arrived. And soon her admirers will be wading in. Moral, make the best of your good features and conceal the worst of your worst. In other and less chaste words, if you've got a face, don't treat it rough.
It was part glamour, part the trend, and part bucking etiquette and restrictions that had been in place before.
In the interwar period, the beauty business became a multi-million-pound industry, aided and abetted by the screen sirens who helped show the ordinary how to achieve the extraordinary.
And remember that to be beautiful and natural is the birthright of every woman.
The influence of these women, of stars, in terms of marketing was colossal.
Practicality went out of the window. Before, you bought a product because you needed it. Now you were buying products because you wanted them, you desired them.
Don't it look cute, huh?
Whenever there was a movie with a different change of makeup or change of hair, platinum blonde, Jean Harlow's platinum blonde, thin plucked eyebrows, it set an enormous trend, and customers were insatiable for it.
Clara Bow created a trend for using eyebrow pencils. She had to use an eyebrow pencil because she was extremely blonde, so you couldn't see her eyebrows on the screen. But she almost changed the faces of women in the UK because of her penciled-on eyebrows, and that technology was new then as well. Clara Bow promoted Max Factor's makeup. She wore his mascara.
It could be said that the creation of the luxury beauty industry started with Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein at the turn of the last century. And by 1935, Helena Rubinstein and Elizabeth Arden, great rivals, it must be said, were the richest businesswomen in the world.
The aspirational model, I think, for a lot of British women had been sort of princesses and the Queen and, the duchesses and things. And if you look in magazines, you see adverts for cosmetics, and it's usually, the Countess of this or the Duchess of that who's endorsing it. And then, of course, come in the film stars, and there's Jean Harlow and Myrna Law and all this sort of thing. And all of a sudden, perhaps you don't want to be a princess. Perhaps actually what you want to be is a film star in a lovely, slinky satin dress.
Film is the showcase of consumption. It is the thing where you look and you think, I'd like to buy that, or I'd like to have that. And that activity obviously is understood to be American, and it's through the 30s that we sort of start to get comfortable with that activity. There's a great Punch cartoon, which is a Bestel cartoon from 1930, which shows a cinema much like this, full of people, and on the screen there's a sort of madman strangling this young woman. Her back's to the screen, and she's got this beautiful Marcel wave, and one of the women in the auditorium turns to the other and says, "There, that's the hairdo I was talking about." There's this real sense, even in the period, that actually cinema isn't just about narratives, it's about showing you a lifestyle that you might want to emulate on the screen.
American cinema was influencing British women, and the old order was not amused. The first UK census after the Great War revealed there were almost 2 million more women than men, and these unconventional singletons were proving a problem.
There's a lot of anger, a lot of feeling of defensiveness, a lot of paranoia from an older generation of men, feeling that young, free, single, liberated, possibly sexually liberated women are going to rise up and take over the world.
These thoroughly modern millies were known as the flappers, a product of America. They struck fear into the establishment.
The flapper was dangerous because she wasn't married, she was single, she was young, she was emancipated, she smoked, she drank, she appeared not to care about getting married and having a family and all that kind of thing.
There was a great deal of controversy what to do with them. There was the husband hunt, it was described as. Everyone was thought to be out there, doing their best to doll themselves up in the hope of catching a man, and there was a lot of pointing the finger at the new fashions, at the raising of skirts and the donning of silky legwear, and sort of girls who were no better than they ought to be, wearing makeup and lipstick because they were hoping to catch a husband. So it was very much a kind of accusational tone.
There was a famous editorial in the Daily Express in 1927 which said that British people talk American, think American, dream American, that in fact that many women in particular were becoming temporary American citizens, and they were particularly anxious about the so-called flapper voters, the women under 30 who they felt would be able to sway the political system their way. And this created a campaign, a crusade against the flapper vote, which filled a lot of column inches in 1927 and 28.
There's one pamphlet written by a man called Shall Flappers Rule? And his view was that flappers were that it was monstrous that these frivolous young women should be allowed to have an electoral voice, and of course they did. They brought in a Labour government that year.
Now women were represented in Parliament, there was new legislation concerning women's rights. Public service was open to them, and Margaret Bondfield became the first woman cabinet minister. To these women, emancipation meant the chance to play an active part in politics, and to serve the far greater number of women for whom emancipation meant other things entirely.
These women with other things on their minds were the most regular cinema goers of the period. The movies were an escape, in more ways than one.
You better come up and see me. There's something about men.
Hello, Bussy. You haven't proposed to me yet tonight.
Women couldn't really go into pubs. There weren't many public spaces that women could go to. They could go to dance halls, of course, when they were younger. But, women could go to the cinema. They could even go on their own. They could go with their friends. They could go in the afternoon.
Some 85 to 90% of films shown in Britain were from America. Only 5% or so were British made, and this led to a lot of anxiety amongst the British cultural elites.
During the First World War, the Hollywood studios had flourished, and now in peacetime, the British film industry was only a bit-part player.
Everything in Britain was subsumed by the effort of winning the war in the 1910s. By the time the 1920s come along, Hollywood's already up and running. It is an industry with its own momentum that there's no way that Britain can catch up with that, because you've already got experienced actors, directors, producers, you've got the whole advertising industry and marketing industry working. They have a top-down control of their industry, so everything it's wrapped up. There's no way that England could compete.
There's an economic concern, which is obviously there's a load of money that is coming out of British pockets and then going to foreign companies. There's also a sort of cultural argument about an anxiety that somehow a British way of life is not being shown on the screen, that a generation of young people are being kind of brought up to understand America as a kind of place of opportunity and excitement, as opposed to Britain, which, by comparison to what they see on the Hollywood screen, seems rather dull and drab and dreary and unpleasant.
Snooky.
What?
When I wrote this song, I was thinking about you.
Were you really?
Weak on fantasy, but strong on reality, the British film industry was out of touch with modern aspirations and in danger of disappearing. The government stepped in. In 1927, an act was passed to increase the number of home-produced films screened in British cinemas. The result was the wholesome and hearty quota quickies.
When people admire America too much, then, of course, the question starts to come up, why are we eating worse food? Why are we living in worse houses? What are we doing wrong? So to counteract that, what you have to say is, yes, it's true you're living in a, two up, two down with no bathroom, but on the other hand, you've got British spirit, you've got British values, you've got this marvellous camaraderie, you've got culture.
I don't know what this generation's coming to.
This generation is the same as any other. It's out for a good time while the going's good, and I don't blame them. Anyway, Sylvia will make Frank a good wife.
Frank, what's that?
I don't know. Anyway, it was a very fruity one.
What Quota Quickies did was they offered a different kind of cinema entertainment. They were much more indigenous. Often they were much more based around familiarity rather than glamour.
I ain't afraid of catching cold anyway.
Catching cold? You've always got one.
Here was an opportunity to win back the home audience. But Brits had grown used to the sophistication of Hollywood.
You move, I'll shoot.
And the cinema-going public expected nothing less.
I never saw anything.
Well, it was behind you.
Was it? Don't be silly. Can't have been.
Part of the problem, though, was that the response was that fairly cheap and shoddy films were made in Britain, the so-called quota quickies, just to fill the quotas and to respond to this new law. And that didn't help the British cinema in the short term at all, because British films just perpetuated the reputation for poor filmmaking.
I say, Auntie, here's something right up your street.
The legend of them is that they were so dreadful they were unwatchable, and they were shown at 10 o'clock in the morning when the cleaners were in the cinema, and so nobody ever saw them.
Half an hour ago you said you wanted to tell me something.
Yes.
Glamour wasn't the only thing missing. They even struggled to capture vital moments.
You see, Sylvia, we've known each other for quite a time now.
10 days to be exact.
Yes. Well, what I wanted to ask you was, could you...
Frank, are you proposing to me?
Yes.
Really, the trouble with British cinema was that it found it very, very difficult to generate any stars. Partly this was the type of people who were in the acting profession. Most of them came from a theatre background. Most of them were upper middle class. They had metropolitan accents, and they didn't have the classless appeal and the glamour of the American stars that was cultivated by the American studio system.
Hooray! The party is waking up at last.
The biggest stars in the 30s in Britain are Gracie Fields and George Formby, who again, they're not stars who trade in glamour, they are stars who trade in familiarity. And indeed, Gracie Fields, quite a lot of Fields' films are about the contrast between her ordinariness and a kind of glamorous world.
Interestingly, humour seems to play more of a role when it comes to British stars. If you look at the films from the 20s and certainly the 30s, there seems to be a kind of a chirpy and quite often working class ethic running through it as well. It was almost like, we're definitely one of you, we share your values and aspirations, your pluck, if you like, and it's us against a slightly uncaring and difficult world.
It was either these sort of bloodless, sort of anyone for tennis things, or, and that sort of other end of it. But neither were the kind of highly sexualized gods and goddesses of the American screen.
Britain did finally attempt to play Hollywood at their own glamour game, but films like the 1937 musical Gangway were peddling a completely different message about America.
Gangway, I'm shouting gangway. I've got a very extraordinary date to meet the one I love.
Gangway, I'm shouting gangway. The Jesse Matthews movies express a kind of cheery gallantry.
Coming down the street and hurry, hurry, hurry to the only one that I adore. Get your feet off my desk.
These films are, they're not quota quickies, they are big budget British films, and they are ambitious to be exported to Hollywood. So they are really trying to compete with Hollywood films.
Nothing ever happens in England. Those birds in America have all the fun. Gangsters,
Riots,
fires,
earthquakes,
racketeers.
murders.
Gee, what a swell country to live in.
Just think, Joe, what fun it is to be a newspaper woman like the ones in the American movies. Wisecracking with the boss, sitting around with the boys, then the alarm and off you go. If they'd only give me half a chance round here, I'd get some front page news.
She's like, I wish I was an American girl in an American film. It'd be so marvellous. And of course, in the narrative, she then gets that opportunity. So she goes to America. She's gets involved in this kind of detective narrative. And of course, what she realises from going to America is that it's actually quite scary.
What on earth are you doing?
Keep looking straight ahead, sister. Don't try to pull anything. Remember, there's a gat sticking right into your ribs.
A gat?
A gat, a rod, a gun.
By the end of the film, she's like, oh, let me go home.
Just a minute. I forgot something.
What?
I forgot to stay home.
Ah, she's always kidding.
In real life, Jessie Matthews did remember to stay home. But for many other Brits, the Hollywood studios called and proved to be their salvation.
Cary Grant is a pretty classic example, Archie Leach from Bristol, that he had a sort of cheeky chappy thing, and if he'd stayed here, he probably would have been, playing the spoons on the halls. But Hollywood spotted something in him, and they developed his looks, and they developed his charm and his quirkiness, and eventually you have one of the greatest stars of all time.
You lied to me.
No, well, I did just
Telling me a ridiculous story about a leopard.
A ridiculous story. I have a leopard.
Well, where is the
right
leopard?
In there.
I don't believe you, Susan.
But you have to believe me.
I've been a victim of your unbridled imagination once more. All the way you're talking about.
Most British, potential British stars actually achieved their fame through going to Hollywood. So people like Charlie Chaplin, Cary Grant, Vivian Leigh, Leslie Howard, all made their name by going to Hollywood, as did some of the key directors like Alfred Hitchcock, and made their name there. So this was the trouble that Britain had keeping on to its talent when Hollywood had all the riches and had all the power.
For working class men like Cary Grant, the British class system conspired to keep them in their place. The USA, on the other hand, was the land of opportunity, where rags to riches stories didn't just happen in the movies. But America was viewed with suspicion, and in a period of growing anti-Semitism, the Jewish movie moguls were accused of undermining old-fashioned British values.
There was a great deal of snobberishness about this, a great deal of snobbery, a great deal of the idea that, British culture was being diluted, British taste was being diluted by this vulgar newcomer, because after all, America was still regarded very much as an upstart nation, founded, as it were, by the British. Now they were biting back, and they were going to sort of take over British culture, they were going to take over British ways of life, and this was in music, in theatre, in cinema, and of course just in goods, and this obviously was something which was resented, particularly by the mandarins and the holders, as it were, of the British tradition.
America was viewed with suspicion by many of the British cultural elites because it was seen as a rather brash, emotional, unrestrained society, materialistic, without the social and cultural hierarchies that were secure in Britain. But Hollywood in particular was seen as a hotbed of scandal.
In the 1920s, a lot of Hollywood stars caused scandal by divorcing each other, by taking drugs, by dying in unfortunate circumstances. And there's a sense throughout, as the 20s go on, that Hollywood is projecting a sort of unhealthy image to the world.
In the 20s and 30s, Chicago mobsters were not only causing a problem in America.
Gangster films are a classic example of a film showing behaviour which creates a certain amount of concern amongst the authorities.
There's only one thing that gets orders and gives orders, and this is it. I'm going to write my name all over this town with it in big letters. Hey, stop him, somebody! Get out of my way, Johnny, I'm going to spit!
Very rarely were they scruffy gangsters. They were dressed up to the nines in fantastically cut suits, hats maybe pulled down over their eyes, their shoulders hunched up almost to sort of hide their necks. They had particular ways of walking that many people in Britain and other countries certainly imitated.
Classically in gangster movies, films like The Public Enemy or Scarface, there's a kind of point in the movie where the kind of young guy from the streets has made enough money as a gangster and he kind of transforms himself. So you get a point where I think there's a point where Jimmy Cagney arrives in a new car or, in a new set of clothes. And there's this sort of sense of having made it and displaying that having made it through dress. And that's very not British.
Arnie, you're through. You hire these mugs, they missed, now you're through. If you ain't out of town by tomorrow morning, you won't never leave it except in a pine box. I'm taking over this territory.
Many British cultural critics of the time dismissed cinema as neither art nor smart. The arrival of cinema sound provided them with more ammunition to fire at the Americans.
When the talkies come in, there's a lot of concern about the ways in which sound will affect the use of the English language. So there's various commentators who say things like, we don't want people saying, oh yeah, and says you, and all this terrible American slang, how vulgar. We want to have a film industry which reminds people of the greatness of British literature, of the beauty of the English language, and so forth and so on.
What are you driving at?
Jean Harlow was a star who had a massive worldwide impact, mainly because of her trademark hair, the platinum blonde, but also because of her manner.
You bet you ain't. You think I sit home all day looking at bracelets? Ha! Of all the dumb bunnies. What do you think I'm doing while you're out pulling your dirty deals? Waiting for Daddy to come home?
She had this very sort of rough, sharp, wisecracking way of speaking, which meant that when she was situated in films which were often high class, in fact, she's often dressed in shimmering white frocks, pictured in hotels, in luxury homes, she appears to be, in a way, both at home as a film star and out of place as Jean Harlow, the woman from the street. And I think that paradox, in a way, was something that made her very appealing to British audiences.
I've told you 1,000,000 times not to talk to me when I'm doing my lashes.
And don't you talk to me when I'm shaving.
Hollywood created for the female audience, because they were female-supported stars, they created the concept of the woman who is tremendously well-dressed and always in wonderful tailoring and beautiful and white fox and white this and that and the feathers and the thing, but always with the right thing to say. There was no l'esprit d'escalier for these dames. They had it on the tip of their tongue. And so they would, Rosalind, front page, whack, whack, whack. And this was a kind of, for me, healthy fantasy. This was the empowered woman who also attracted women because she looked great, and her makeup was great, and her hair was great, and everything was great. But she was nobody's fool.
But in the land of opportunity, things were far from perfect. America's rags to riches story was suddenly going into reverse.
And in the richest country in the world, in towering Wall Street, disaster. The money castles came crashing down, and fortunes dissolved in a day.
Mass production had fueled a spending spree that couldn't be sustained. And in 1929, the US stock market collapsed, creating a worldwide financial disaster.
The Depression only affected, obviously, part of Britain, but where it did affect in the north, the northeast, Wales, Scotland, it was very real. The cinema could provide escapism from that, of course. And it's very interesting in sort of places like South Wales, where there was a strong tradition of miners' institutes. A lot of miners' institutes would build a cinema or hold film shows in their halls. And those people that running the cinemas or running the miners' institutes would want to have, good socially educative films. Often what the population wanted was just glamour. They wanted to see Shirley Temple in The Good Ship Lollipop. They wanted to show films that just showed a better life. They wanted to lose themselves for a couple of hours in something that was lovely, rather than necessarily having the realism which they had plenty of in their daily lives.
There you go. Thank you kindly. I don't suspicion you have any loaf bread, though.
Look inside.
That's mighty. I ain't seen that much eatin's ever in my born life.
The poorer and more reduced the majority of the population, the greater the level of glamour and beauty and escapism that they want to see on the screen.
One of the interesting things about the cinema in the 1930s is that it continues to grow, the audiences continue to rise, people still are drawn in by the glamour of the cinema, despite the fact that there's a depression, and working class men and women still wanted to spend their money on the cinema and were still attracted to the dreams and fantasies of the whole Hollywood scene.
In the 1930s, a new state-of-the-art movie theatre was opening every week on the British High Street. Bigger, better, and still easily affordable, the Hollywood experience moved up a gear.
Scenes of enthusiasm such as the district has never witnessed before marked the grand opening of the Odeon Cinema.
The cinemas in the 30s were the first introduction to luxury for a lot of people. There were carpets, there were soft lighting, there were usherettes in uniform, there were cigarette girls, there were people selling chocolates. They were known as dream palaces, and this was what they were really. And of course all the architecture showed that. For the price of a shilling, you could come off the miserable streets of Glasgow or the Elephant and Castle, and you could sit in a soft velour seat surrounded by soft lights, be served by an usherette. And of course also the cinema owners were very well aware of that, and they encouraged their page boys, the cigarette girls and things, to welcome people in, as if it was, as it were, the Dorchester along the Old Kent Road.
Hardship and poverty fed our desire for escapism, and Hollywood, even in a depression, managed to deliver just what audiences needed.
Gold diggers of 1933 get these shining stars who are really like gods and goddesses, and they do these glamorous films, and then in the middle of them 100 dancers jump out. Yeah.
We're in the money, we're in the money. We've got a lot of what it takes to get along.
In Gold Diggers of 1933, Hollywood puts its own spin on the Depression. Nothing, it seemed, could get America down.
We've got a lot of what it takes to get along.
The key moment for me is the point where one of their mates shows up and says, there's an audition, there's a new show going on, we must all go down and audition. And they realise that they can't audition because they don't have any clothes to wear. They don't look glamorous. They don't look like showgirls because they've had to pawn all their clothes. And the one person who has got a job in a drugstore, and she's wearing the drugstore uniform. And so they draw lots to see who will get to wear the frock that she's wearing in order to go to the audition, in order to then try and get them all jobs.
You gotta give Carol that dress.
Don't, I've got to go back to the drugstore.
Oh, we'll give you something good enough for a drugstore.
I know, but the dress belongs to them. I'm a hostess there.
And still.
So am I a hostess? I've got to entertain Bonnie with the idea of putting us to work.
There's this real sense in which even a uniform from a drugstore is glamorous enough to be able to then market yourself as a showgirl, to then market the glamour of, what a showgirl represents.
We're in the money, oh, I'm on the honey. Let's let it, spend it, send it, rolling around.
There's a sense in which if you can pretend to be the thing that you're trying to be, you can sort of pass in this economy as that thing.
Don't forget to stand in the light, Carol, when you're talking to Barney. Gee, they certainly know what they're doing when they dress their hostesses in that drugstore.
Well, you don't look bad.
2024, take 2.
And behind the scenes at the movies, Hollywood's big players were starting to dictate women's shapes and sizes.
production numbers of director Busby Berkeley provide not only escape from the Depression, but a rare combination of picture and sound.
Busby Berkeley is a good example of the search for the perfect form, the perfect woman. He would line his chorus girls up against a grid to make sure that their measurements were all in proportion and that they achieved a kind of standard of beauty.
Weight, shape, color of eyes and hair, dancing ability and screen personality form the basis on which the girls are being selected.
With Hollywood setting such high standards, British women now had to start worrying about the whole package.
This is when people discovered calories. So not only are people copying Hollywood stars and their diets and lifestyles, but they're also starting to count calories for the first time. The most popular bestseller of the 1920s was a diet book. So this was the beginning, in a way, of the kind of body shaping that we see today.
I mean, the craze for slimming was certainly, I think, influenced by Hollywood just as much, and a lot of the fashions were very clingy. I mean, you know, satin is a very slinky, but it's a very unforgiving fabric, in fact. So I think Hollywood did certainly influence people's desire to, you know, keep the, you know, zest for life and health and beauty and all those things. And of course, Busby Berkeley, all the idea of sort of synchronized dancing, synchronized exercising was very much a 30s thing.
The ladies of Cambridge like to feel that they're ahead on most subjects. And now that physical training is the rage, they're showing the world what they can do. It doesn't guarantee to make them all film stars, but it gives them poise, balance and beauty. And as far as the beauty goes, they don't seem to be doing so badly. All right, I'll buy the second one in the third row.
There are certain eras where the kind of zeitgeist is so strong that everyone wants to join it. Everyone wants to look like they're supposed to look. And really the 20s and 30s is one of those periods where the girls of the season and the girls working in a shop in Doncaster were essentially after the same look. They have abandoned the more traditional British concept that the classes dress to look differently. You know, there was a conscious desire among the classes to express their rank through their clothing. And their parents in 1910, you know, you could have spotted practically their income by what they were wearing. And that went in the 20s and 30s.
In the 20s, Paris set the fashion trends. But in the 30s, it was film stars leading the way in impossibly glamorous outfits created by Hollywood's costume designers.
It's absolutely essential to understand how important the film costume designers were. They were, in their heyday in the 30s, much more powerful than the so-called international Parisienne designers. Adrian at MGM, Travis Banton at Paramount, Ori Kelly at Warner Brothers. I mean, these men were part of the inner circle of the coterie of the most famous, wealthiest and glamorous women in the world, and they dressed them. They hid their lumps and bumps and short necks and small breasts and big backsides, and, you know, they were very powerful, and their clothes were much copied. When Adrian did an organdy ruffled dress, for example, for Joan Crawford in Letty Linton, Macy's sold 500,000 copies of it.
Since the 20s, American manufacturers had been exploiting the demand for film star frocks. Now, British women could achieve the glamorous Hollywood look at high street prices.
When rayon was invented in the mid-1920s, became the working girl's best friend, you know. Nylon stockings later, for example, so you didn't have to have silk stockings. You could have a fashion copy blouse, maybe for, you know, £2 and 10 shillings, as it would have been in those days, which before that would have cost, you know, more than double a week's wages.
In the 30s, because of mass consumption, the beginning of mass consumption, and the beginning of a little bit more disposable income, it was possible to not necessarily to have your mother run up your clothes. You know, you could see something in a magazine, you could go to a shop, you know, and you could buy it. So in a sense, looking good, looking beautiful became within the purchasing power of a great deal more people than had. So it wasn't just a question of sort of admiring beauty from afar. You could try and appropriate it for yourself.
American-style department stores were now offering shoppers of any income a chance to wander around, inspecting all the items on sale, without suffering the embarrassment of having to ask the price.
I mean, Woolworths was a great model. Marks & Spencer's, for example, one of their chief executives went to America to, you know, find out how Woolworths was doing it.
Certainly amongst some of the British cultural elites there was a fear and anxiety about the department store, the materialism which it was supposed to encourage, the informality of the display and the interaction between the shopkeeper and the public. So to some extent they became another avenue of Americanization in the period.
America continued to fascinate British audiences, yet what they were seeing was neither entirely accurate nor especially good for their health.
Most cinema goers got a completely false impression of what America was like. I mean, it was either the wide skies of Montana and the cowboy films, or it was a chrome and glass-plated Manhattan penthouse. Every hour, the martini hour.
Respectable women before the war did not smoke or drink in either America or England. And so when women started smoking in public and drinking, getting drunk, it was a revolution, an utter revolution.
Do you realize we'd be sitting here for over an hour without smoking?
I was just thinking that.
Women were smoking cigarettes because American tobacco companies were promoting directly to women.
The sheer amount of smoking that goes on is enormous, and it's really shocking to see that today, actually. I think there's something about the gesture of smoking that's inherently glamorous. I can't exactly tell you what it is, but it's true that even now when you watch an old movie and people are smoking, it's perhaps also something to do with the way that the light works on the smoke as well. So the black and white with the smoke going up to the ceiling and the way that it's lit, this creates an idea of glamour as well. So I think that probably appeals to people. But there's something elegant about the gesture and the way that you're forced to sit or hold yourself when you're smoking a cigarette.
Cocktails sprang up as a response to Prohibition in America, so we now think of the 20s and 30s as being the kind of cocktail era in this country as well, but people didn't need to drink cocktails in this country because booze was legal. The only reason cocktails were invented was to mask the taste of bootleg liquor. So yes, America's having a huge influence. The fact that people are drinking cocktails at all in England is a direct result of American influence.
To a successful trip and a quick return.
I can do better than that. Here's to all of us, just as we are.
As the 1930s progressed, the rising threat of global conflict cast a shadow over the country, and by the decade's close, Britain would once again be at war with Germany.
By the end of the 30s, women are having to move off centre stage. And of course, during the war, in the early days of the war, most of the films were about, war and war situations, because there was the idea that people kind of wanted realism. Not only did they want realism, but they needed to have the sort of films that would show them how to cope with this quite impossible situation.
The big event the whole country is talking about, Mrs. Miniver, a timely drama, tuned to the terrific tempo of the world of today. Mrs. Miniver, the story of a valiant woman whose love and devotion shield her family from the cruelest onslaught of devastation ever visited upon mankind.
Films like Mrs. Miniver were Hollywood's contribution to the war effort. Propaganda to edge Americans towards supporting Britain in the fight against Nazi Germany.
Mrs. Miniver takes you from a sort of relatively carefree lifestyle through into a wartime situation. That film itself traces the shift from glamour to fighting for survival.
In a sense, the future does lie, or is seen to lie, with men again.
Pack up your troubles in your own kit bag and smile, smile, smile.
In wartime, there would be less call for Hollywood's fantasy. British moviegoers wanted a dose of traditional values and homegrown pluck.
Part of the war effort was putting on a smile, boys, smile. That's something the Americans don't give you. That sort of cheeky, chappy cheeriness. And I think it's nice.
But in a time of air raids, military uniforms and rationing, our Hollywood-gifted obsession with glamour served as a secret weapon to boost British morale.
Mrs. Clark made her frock from a pair of her husband's old +4 trousers and half a yard of new material.
Dreams of better lives may have been on hold, but our interwar infatuation with luxury and glamour has had a lasting effect on British society.
I think the glamour of the 1920s and perhaps especially the 1930s left a deep mark on British society, and above all on the expectations and aspirations of the audiences of the films at that time. There's no question that the post-war consumer boom was fueled by the dreams that Hollywood peddled to British audiences in the 1930s.
That perception of buying into glamour, buying into something pretty, buying into something that's like me time in front of the mirror on the dressing table. Whether you approve of it or disapprove of it, it's very real.
Even today, America film still represents the sort of glamorous lifestyle. Ocean's 11, you don't go to see Ocean's 11 expecting to see a lifestyle that is like your own on the screen. Whereas British films, you might go to a British film expecting to see something more like your own life.
The artifice of the Hollywood fantasy has become clearer to us as the decades pass. Yet despite ourselves, we're still seduced by the tinsel-touched lifestyle we so often encounter in American movies. In cinema, as in life, there remains a yearning for the undeniable allure of Hollywood's golden age and its oh so enticing glamour. A glamour that changed the world forever.